The blood on Jake Morrison's hands was still fresh when he rode into Dusty Creek, Texas in the summer of 1878, and the last thing he expected to find in this sun-baked town was a reason to stay. He had been running for 3 weeks, ever since the shootout in Abilene that left 2 men dead, and his reputation as a fast gun cemented in whiskey-soaked saloons from Kansas to the Rio Grande. The horse beneath him was exhausted, foam flecking its dark coat, and Jake knew he needed to stop somewhere long enough to let the animal rest and to figure out what came next. Dusty Creek looked like every other frontier town he had passed through, a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a single dirt road, false-fronted shops promising goods and services to ranchers and cowboys passing through. The heat shimmered off the ground in waves, making the whole place look like a mirage that might disappear if he blinked too hard. Jake guided his horse toward the livery stable at the edge of town, his sharp eyes scanning the streets for any sign of trouble. At 26, he had learned to read danger in the tilt of a man's hat, the way a hand rested too close to a gun belt, the sudden silence that fell when a stranger walked into a room. But Dusty Creek seemed peaceful enough on this Saturday afternoon. Just farmers and their families loading supplies onto wagons, a few cowhands lounging outside the saloon, and an old dog sleeping in the shade of the general store's porch. The livery owner, a grizzled man with more beard than face, took Jake's horse without much conversation beyond agreeing on a price for boarding and feed. Jake paid him, shouldered his saddlebags, and stepped back into the brutal afternoon sun. He needed a room, a bath, and enough time to decide whether to keep running or to finally stop and face whatever consequences were chasing him. The boarding house sat 2 buildings down from the saloon, a 2-story structure that had once been painted white but had faded to the color of old bones. A hand-lettered sign in the window advertised clean rooms and hot meals, which sounded like paradise after weeks of sleeping on hard ground and eating whatever game he could shoot. Jake pushed through the front door, the hinges squeaking in protest, and found himself in a small entry hall that smelled of lye soap and baking bread. "Be right with you," a woman's voice called from somewhere in the back of the house, and Jake removed his hat, suddenly aware of how filthy he must look, trail dust coating every inch of him. He heard footsteps, and then she appeared in the doorway that led to what he assumed was the kitchen, and Jake Morrison, who had faced down armed men without flinching, felt something in his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple style and eyes the color of creek water in summer, that particular shade of green-brown that changed depending on the light. She wore a plain cotton dress, faded from many washings, and an apron dusted with flour. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance by conventional standards. No elaborate beauty that would stop traffic on a city street, but something in the way she carried herself, the directness of her gaze, the small smile that touched her lips, made Jake forget for a moment why he had come to Dusty Creek in the first place. "I need a room," he managed to say, his voice rougher than he intended. "We have one available upstairs, second door on the right," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "It is 50 cents a night, and that includes breakfast and supper if you want it. Bath is extra, but you look like you could use one if you do not mind my saying so." Jake found himself smiling despite everything. "I reckon I could at that. How much?" "Another quarter and I will heat the water myself. Give me about an hour to get it ready." She moved to a small desk in the corner and pulled out a ledger. "What name should I put down?" He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, old instincts warring with a sudden, inexplicable desire to be honest with this woman. "Jake Morrison." If the name meant anything to her, she did not show it. She simply wrote it down in neat script and then looked up at him again. "I am Sarah Bennett. My aunt owns this boarding house, but she is visiting family in San Antonio, so I am managing things while she is gone. Your room is ready now if you want to go up and rest before the bath is ready." That sounds good, Miss Bennett. Jake paid her for 3 nights, figuring that would give him enough time to rest and plan his next move, and she gave him a key attached to a small wooden fob. "Supper is at 6, she said as he turned toward the stairs. "And welcome to Dusty Creek, Mr. Morrison." He nodded and climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight, and found the room exactly as advertised. Small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the main street. Jake dropped his saddlebags on the floor, set his gun belt on the chair, and lay down on the bed without bothering to remove his boots. The mattress was lumpy but felt like luxury after weeks on the ground, and he closed his eyes, intending to rest for just a few minutes. When he woke, the light slanting through the window had changed, and he realized he had been asleep for hours. The angle of the sun suggested it was late afternoon, and Jake sat up quickly, disoriented for a moment before remembering where he was. A knock on the door made him reach instinctively for his gun, but then Sarah's voice came through the wood. "Mr. Morrison, your bath is ready downstairs if you still want it." "I will be right down," he called back, buckling on his gun belt more out of habit than necessity and grabbing a clean shirt from his saddlebags. The bathing room was off the kitchen, a small space with a copper tub that Sarah had filled with steaming water. She had left soap and towels on a stool beside the tub, and Jake felt a wave of gratitude for this simple luxury. He stripped off his filthy clothes and sank into the hot water with a groan of pure pleasure, feeling weeks of trail grime and tension begin to dissolve. He scrubbed himself thoroughly, washing his hair twice and watching the water turn gray with dirt, and by the time he climbed out and dried off, he felt almost human again. The clean shirt felt strange against his skin after so long in the same sweat-stained clothes, and he ran a hand through his damp hair, wishing he had time for a shave, but knowing the supper hour was approaching. When he emerged from the bathing room, he found Sarah in the kitchen, working at the stove. The room was warm despite the heat outside, and the smell of cooking food made his stomach clench with hunger. She glanced over her shoulder as he entered, and something flickered in her eyes, an expression too quick to read. "Feel better?" she asked, turning back to the pot she was stirring. "Yes, ma'am, considerably." Jake hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether he should leave or stay. "Can I help with anything?" She looked surprised. "You want to help with supper?" "I have spent enough time on cattle drives to know my way around a kitchen," he said, which was true enough. "And you have been kind enough to me already. Seems only fair to offer." Sarah studied him for a moment, as if trying to figure out what kind of man would make such an offer, and then she nodded toward the table. "You can slice that bread if you want. Knife is in the drawer." They worked in companionable silence for a while, Jake cutting thick slices of fresh bread while Sarah finished preparing what appeared to be beef stew and biscuits. The domesticity of the scene struck him as surreal after weeks of running and violence, and he found himself relaxing in a way he had not expected. "How long have you been running this place?" he asked after a while. "My aunt has owned it for about 5 years, but I have only been here for a few months." Sarah pulled the biscuits from the oven, each one perfectly golden. "I came out from Missouri after my parents died. Cholera took them both last winter, and my aunt was kind enough to offer me a place to stay and work." "I am sorry about your parents," Jake said, and meant it. She nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "It was hard, but life keeps moving whether we are ready for it or not." "What brings you to Dusty Creek, Mr. Morrison?" The question was casual, but Jake sensed the intelligence behind it, the curiosity. He chose his words carefully. "Just passing through looking for work. Thought I might see if any of the ranches around here need an extra hand." "There are a few big spreads within riding distance," Sarah said. "The Triple Bar to the north is always looking for good men, or so I hear. The owner, Mr. Fletcher, comes into town every few weeks for supplies." Before Jake could respond, the front door opened and he heard voices in the entry hall. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the sound, and Jake followed, curious about the other boarders. There were 3 men, all of them cowhands by the look of their clothes and sun-weathered faces. They nodded politely to Sarah and eyed Jake with the casual wariness of men who spent their lives among strangers. Introductions were made, Jake learning that the 3 worked for a ranch to the east and were staying in town for a few days before heading back out on the range. Supper was served in a small dining room off the kitchen, everyone sitting around a scarred wooden table that had seen decades of use. The food was simple but good, and Jake found himself enjoying the easy conversation of men who worked hard and expected little from life beyond a fair wage and a hot meal. They talked about cattle prices, the lack of rain, a horse race that was scheduled for the following weekend in a nearby town, and through it all, Jake watched Sarah move between the kitchen and dining room, refilling bowls and making sure everyone had what they needed. She was efficient without being rushed, friendly without being familiar, and Jake noticed the way the other men watched her too. A respectful appreciation that seemed free of the crude intentions he had seen directed at women in saloons and dance halls. Sarah Bennett, he realized, was the kind of woman who commanded respect without demanding it, whose mere presence elevated the behavior of those around her. After supper, the other boarders drifted off to the saloon or their rooms, and Jake offered to help with the dishes. Sarah accepted this time without surprise, and they fell into an easy rhythm, Jake washing while she dried and put away. The kitchen window was open, letting in the slightly cooler evening air, and Jake could hear the sounds of the town settling into night, the distant plinking of a piano from the saloon, the bark of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels on the dry street. "You are not like most drifters who come through here," Sarah said after a while, her voice thoughtful, Jake's hands stilled in the dishwater. "How so? Most men who are just passing through do not offer to help with chores. They take what they need and move on without much thought for anyone else." She set down the plate she had been drying and looked at him directly. "You carry yourself like a man who is used to trouble, but you have good manners and kind eyes. It is an interesting combination." He should have deflected, should have changed the subject or made some joke to lighten the mood, but instead he found himself saying, "I have done things I am not proud of, Miss Bennett. Things that have put me on a path I am not sure how to get off. But I am trying to figure out if it is too late to be someone different." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jake thought he had said too much, revealed too much of the darkness that followed him. But then she smiled, a small, sad smile that held understanding. "I do not think it is ever too late, Mr. Morrison. God knows we all carry regrets. The question is whether we let them define us or whether we use them to become better." "You sound like you have some experience with regret yourself," Jake said softly. "Everyone does if they have lived long enough and paid attention." She picked up another dish to dry. "The trick is not letting it consume you." They finished the dishes in silence, and Jake bid her good night, climbing the stairs to his small room with his mind full of thoughts he could not quite organize. He lay in bed listening to the sounds of the town and thinking about Sarah Bennett's words, about whether a man could truly change or whether the things he had done marked him permanently. He woke early the next morning, the habit of years on the trail too ingrained to sleep past dawn even in the relative comfort of a real bed. The boarding house was quiet, and Jake dressed slowly, strapping on his gun belt and then pausing, staring at the leather and metal that had become such an extension of himself. How many men had he faced down with this gun? How many had died because he was faster, more accurate, more willing to pull the trigger, shaking off the dark thoughts? Jake headed downstairs, expecting to find the house still asleep. But as he reached the ground floor, he heard sounds from the kitchen, and he moved quietly toward the doorway, not wanting to intrude. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Sarah stood in front of a small mirror hung near the window, the early morning light streaming through and turning her hair to burnished copper where the sun caught it. She had taken it down from its usual simple arrangement, and it fell in a thick curtain past her shoulders, a rich dark brown that held hints of red. As Jake watched, frozen in the doorway, she began to braid it with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving in the age-old pattern, weaving 3 sections over and under, the braid taking shape like something alive. There was something achingly intimate about the scene, something that spoke of domestic routines and private moments, the small rituals that made up a life. Sarah's face in the mirror was serene, her thoughts clearly somewhere else as her hands worked through the familiar motions, and Jake felt like an intruder witnessing something not meant for his eyes, but he could not look away. The braid grew longer, neat and even, and when she reached the end, Sarah tied it off with a simple ribbon and then coiled it at the base of her neck, pinning it in place with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. The whole process had taken perhaps 5 minutes, but Jake felt as if he had witnessed something profound, a glimpse into who Sarah Bennett truly was when she thought no one was watching. She turned from the mirror and saw him standing there, and color flooded her cheeks. "Mr. Morrison." "I did not hear you come down." "I am sorry," Jake said, finding his voice. "I did not mean to intrude. I just came down for some coffee if there is any." "Of course." She moved to the stove, where a pot was already heating, and poured him a cup, her hands steady despite the lingering blush on her cheeks. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in a long time," Jake said honestly, accepting the cup. He should have left it there, should have taken his coffee and gone outside or back to his room, but instead he heard himself say, "That was beautiful." Sarah looked up, confused. "What was?" "Watching you braid your hair." "I know that sounds strange, but there was something about it, something peaceful." He fumbled for words, aware that he probably sounded like a fool. "My mother used to braid her hair every morning when I was a boy. I would sit at the kitchen table and watch her, and it always meant that everything was going to be all right, that the world was safe and ordered. I had not thought about that in years until just now." Sarah's expression softened. "That is not strange at all. I think we all have memories like that, little moments that stay with us and define what home means." "What does home mean to you?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. She thought about it while she poured her own coffee, and they sat down at the small kitchen table together, the house still quiet around them. "I suppose home is anywhere you feel like you belong, where you can be yourself without pretense. I had that with my parents, and I am trying to build it again here with my aunt." "And do you feel like you belong here in Dusty Creek?" "I am starting to," Sarah said. "The people are kind and the work is good. I have always liked taking care of others, making sure they have what they need. It gives me purpose." She sipped her coffee and studied him over the rim of the cup. "What about you, Mr. Morrison? Where is home for you?" Jake looked down at his hands, the calluses and scars that told their own story. "I do not rightly know. I have been drifting for so long that I am not sure I remember what it feels like to have a place to belong." "Maybe you just have not found the right place yet," Sarah said gently. "Or maybe you have not let yourself look." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the other boarders, and the morning routine of breakfast and preparation for the day took over. But as Jake ate the eggs and bacon Sarah prepared, as he listened to the easy chatter of men planning their day, he kept coming back to that image of her braiding her hair, the morning light on her face, the simple beauty of an ordinary moment. He found himself thinking with a sudden fierce certainty that startled him, "I want to see that every day of my life." The thought was absurd, ridiculous even. He had known this woman for less than 24 hours, and he was a wanted man with blood on his hands and a reputation that would follow him wherever he went. He had no business thinking about domesticity and morning rituals, about building a life in one place with one person. And yet the thought would not leave him, persistent as the Texas heat. After breakfast, Jake decided to take Sarah's advice and ride out to the Triple Bar Ranch to ask about work. He needed something to do, some way to occupy his time and his thoughts, and honest work on a ranch seemed as good an option as any. The livery owner's boy saddled his horse while Jake waited, and soon he was riding north out of town, following the directions Sarah had given him. The triple bar spread out across several thousand acres of rangeland, dotted with cattle and the occasional stand of cottonwoods marking where water could be found. The ranch house was a solid structure of wood and stone, built to withstand the harsh Texas weather, and several outbuildings clustered nearby, corrals and barns and bunkhouses that spoke of a successful operation. Jake was met by the foreman, a lean man named Henry Carson, who looked him over with eyes that had seen a lot of men come and go. "You looking for work, if you have anything available," Jake said. "I have ranch experience, good with cattle and horses. Can you rope?" "Well enough." "Sit a bucking horse, when I have to," Carson grunted, which might have been approval. "We could use another hand. Lost 2 men last month, one to a broken leg and another who decided he would rather try his luck in the gold fields. Pay is $30 a month plus room and board. Work is hard, hours are long, and the boss does not tolerate drinking or fighting. You interested?" $30 a month was a fair wage, and the work would keep him busy and away from town most of the time, which might be good for his peace of mind. But even as Jake opened his mouth to accept, he found himself hesitating. Taking a job on the ranch would mean staying in the bunkhouse, eating at the ranch cookhouse, living the life of a cowhand with little time for anything else. It would mean not seeing Sarah Bennett every morning. The realization struck him with uncomfortable force, and Jake had to remind himself that he was being irrational. He barely knew the woman, and attachment was dangerous for someone in his position. But still, the thought of leaving that boarding house, of not sitting at that kitchen table drinking coffee while she moved around preparing breakfast, made something in his chest constrict. "Can I give you an answer tomorrow?" Jake heard himself say. "I want to think about it overnight." Carson shrugged. "Suit yourself. But if you want the job, be back here by sunrise day after tomorrow. We have a big gather coming up and need all the hands we can get." Jake thanked him and rode back toward town, his mind churning. This was the smart move, the sensible thing to do. Take the ranch job, keep his head down, earn some money, and eventually move on before anyone from his past caught up with him. Staying in town, spending time around Sarah, was asking for trouble in more ways than one. But when he got back to Dusty Creek and returned his horse to the livery, Jake found his feet carrying him not to the saloon or his room at the boarding house, but to the general store. He was not sure what he was looking for until he saw it in the store window, a small hand mirror with a carved wooden frame, the kind a woman might use while fixing her hair. He bought it on impulse, ignoring the curious look from the shopkeeper, and carried it back to the boarding house wrapped in brown paper. Sarah was in the kitchen when he arrived, working on what smelled like an apple pie, and she looked up with surprise when he entered. "Mr. Morrison." "Did you ride out to the triple bar?" "I did. The foreman offered me a job." Jake set the wrapped package on the table, suddenly feeling foolish. "I got you something. I hope that is not inappropriate." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing the mirror. Her eyes widened, and she looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Mr. Morrison, this is beautiful, but I cannot accept something like this." "It is just a mirror," Jake said, though they both knew it was more than that. "I saw it and thought of you this morning, braiding your hair. Your mirror in the kitchen is cracked, and I thought maybe you could use a new one." Sarah ran her fingers over the carved frame, and Jake saw the struggle in her face, the war between propriety and desire. Finally, she looked up at him again, and her voice was soft when she spoke. "Thank you. This is very kind, but Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "All right. Are you in trouble with the law?" The question hung in the air between them, and Jake felt the old instinct to lie, to deflect and dodge the way he had done 100 times before. But looking into Sarah's clear eyes, remembering her words about regret and becoming better, he found he could not do it. "Yes," he said simply. "There was a shooting in Kansas. 2 men died, and I was the one who killed them. They drew on me first, but that does not change the fact that they are dead and I am the one who pulled the trigger. There may be people looking for me, and if they find me here, it could bring trouble to your door. That is why I should probably take that ranch job and get out of town for a while." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, still holding the mirror. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than frightened. "Were you defending yourself?" "Yes." "And have you killed men who were not trying to kill you first?" Jake thought about the question, really thought about it. "No, I have a reputation as a fast gun, and that has brought me more than my share of challenges. But I have never drawn on a man who was not threatening me or someone else." "Then you are not a murderer, Mr. Morrison. You are just a man who has been forced into circumstances most people never have to face." Sarah set the mirror down carefully on the table. "I appreciate your honesty, and I will accept this gift because I believe it was given with good intentions. But you need to decide what kind of life you want to live from here on out. If you keep running, you will always be running. If you want to change, you have to stop and face whatever is coming. Even if facing it means prison or worse, even then," Sarah said firmly. "Because the alternative is living half a life, always looking over your shoulder, never letting yourself care about anything or anyone. That is no way to live, and I think you know it." Jake picked up the mirror and turned it over in his hands, seeing his own face reflected back at him, distorted slightly by the curved glass. "What if I do not know how to be anything other than what I am?" "Then you learn," Sarah said. "One day at a time, one choice at a time. You start by deciding to stay and see what happens instead of running. And you think I should stay here in Dusty Creek? I think you should do what your heart tells you is right." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "But I will tell you this, Mr. Morrison. I have seen a lot of men come through this town, drifters and cowboys and men running from something they will not name. Most of them have dead eyes, like they stopped caring about anything a long time ago. You do not have dead eyes. You still care, and that means there is hope for you yet." Jake set the mirror down and found himself moving closer to her, drawn by something he could not name. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Sarah said. "I know you have good manners and you offer to help with dishes. I know you bought me a mirror because you thought I could use it. I know you were honest with me when you could have lied. Those things tell me more about a man's character than a dozen stories about his past." They stood there in the kitchen, close enough that Jake could smell the faint scent of lavender soap and flour that clung to Sarah, and he felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Stay or go, run or face the consequences, keep drifting or take a chance on something different. "I will turn down the ranch job," he heard himself say. "I will stay in town and see if I can find work that lets me keep my room here. But Miss Bennett, I need you to understand that my past might catch up with me, and if it does, I will do everything in my power to make sure it does not touch you." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her face, turning pretty into beautiful. "I understand, Mr. Morrison, and I appreciate the warning, but I am not as fragile as you might think, and I am not afraid of a little trouble if it comes with the possibility of something good." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, and Jake knew with absolute certainty that his life had just changed in ways he could not yet comprehend. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences came from the choices he had made in Kansas, he would face them here in Dusty Creek with this woman who saw something in him worth saving. Over the next few weeks, Jake settled into a routine that felt almost normal. He found work at the livery stable, helping with the horses and doing repairs around the building in exchange for a small wage. It was not glamorous work, but it was honest, and it kept him in town where he could take his meals at Sarah's boarding house and spend his evenings helping her with whatever needed doing. They fell into an easy companionship that felt both natural and slightly dangerous, the line between friendship and something more growing blurrier with each passing day. Jake found excuses to be in the kitchen while Sarah cooked, and she seemed to welcome his presence, their conversations ranging from the mundane details of daily life to deeper discussions about faith and purpose, and what it meant to build a future when the past kept trying to drag you back. And every morning, Jake would wake early and come downstairs to find Sarah braiding her hair, using the mirror he had given her, the early light streaming through the window and turning the moment into something almost sacred. She never acknowledged his presence during this ritual, but she never asked him to leave either, and Jake came to cherish those quiet minutes before the house woke up, when it felt like they existed in a small bubble of peace separate from the rest of the world. He learned things about her in those weeks, small details that painted a fuller picture of who Sarah Bennett was. She had been engaged once, back in Missouri, to a young man who worked at her father's feed store. But he had died of pneumonia the winter before the cholera came, and Sarah had nursed him through his final days, sitting beside his bed and reading to him from the Bible. The experience had left her with a deep appreciation for life's fragility, and a determination to not waste the time she had been given. She loved to read, borrowing books from the few people in town who had them, and Jake would sometimes find her in the evening with a novel in her lap, completely absorbed in whatever story she was following. She had a beautiful singing voice that she was shy about, only letting it emerge when she thought no one was listening, hymns and folk songs that spoke of longing and hope. She was kind to everyone but suffered no fools, and Jake watched her handle drunk cowboys and difficult customers with a firm grace that commanded respect. He told her things too, more than he had ever shared with anyone. About growing up on a small ranch in Colorado, the youngest of 4 boys, and how his parents had died when he was 16, leaving him and his brothers to fend for themselves. How he had drifted south looking for work and fallen in with the wrong crowd, men who saw his natural skill with a gun and encouraged him to develop it. How the first time he had killed a man in self-defense, he had been terrified and sick, but how each subsequent time had been easier until he barely felt anything at all. "That is what scares me," he admitted to her one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sun set over the town. "Not that I have killed, but that I stopped feeling bad about it. What does that say about me as a person?" Sarah rocked slowly in her chair, thinking about his question. "I think it says you are human. We protect ourselves by building walls around the things that hurt us. You built walls around your conscience because feeling the weight of every death would have broken you. But the fact that you recognize what you have lost, that you want to feel again, that tells me your soul is not dead. It is just sleeping and it can be woken up." "How?" Jake asked, desperately wanting to believe her. "By letting yourself care about something again. By choosing to be vulnerable even though it is terrifying. By allowing yourself to hope that tomorrow can be different from yesterday." She turned to look at him, her eyes serious. "You are already doing it, whether you realize it or not. Every day you choose to stay here instead of running, you are waking up a little more." Jake wanted to reach out and take her hand to close the small distance between them, but he held back, aware that Sarah was a respectable woman and he was still a man with a dangerous past. They sat in silence for a while, the evening air cooling slightly as the sun disappeared, and Jake felt something settle in his chest, a contentment he had not known he was capable of feeling. But peace never lasted long for men like Jake Morrison, and the reckoning came on a hot afternoon in late August when 3 riders came into Dusty Creek asking questions about a tall cowboy with dark hair and quick hands. Jake was at the livery when he heard about it, the stable boy running in with wide eyes to report that strangers were making inquiries at the saloon. Every instinct Jake had honed over years of survival kicked into high gear, and he felt the familiar tension coil in his muscles, the old readiness to fight or flee. He made his way carefully toward the main street, staying in the shadows, and observed the 3 men from a distance. They were hard-looking characters, the kind who made their living on the wrong side of the law, and Jake did not recognize them. That could mean they were bounty hunters hired by the families of the men he had killed, or they could be looking for him for some other reason entirely. Either way, their presence in town was a threat not just to him, but to anyone who had shown him kindness. Jake watched them split up, one heading into the general store while the other two continued their questioning at the saloon. He needed to know what they knew and what they wanted before he could decide his next move. Running was always an option, but Sarah's words echoed in his mind. If he kept running, he would always be running. He was trying to decide whether to confront them directly when he saw Sarah emerge from the boarding house, a basket of laundry on her hip, heading toward the clothesline behind the building. She had not seen the strangers yet, and Jake felt a surge of protective fear. If these men learned that he had been staying at her boarding house, they might use her to get to him. Jake moved quickly, intercepting Sarah before she reached the clothesline. She looked startled to see him, and then concerned when she saw the expression on his face. "What is wrong?" "There are men in town asking about me," Jake said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I do not know who they are or what they want, but I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If they come to the boarding house, you tell them I left weeks ago, that you have no idea where I went. Do not give them any reason to think I matter to you, do not try to protect me or defend me. Just tell them what they want to hear and get them out of there as quickly as possible." Sarah set down the laundry basket, her face troubled. "What are you going to do?" "I am going to find out what they want and deal with it." Jake wanted to say more, wanted to tell her that meeting her had changed everything, that the thought of bringing danger to her door made him feel things he had thought himself incapable of feeling. But there was no time for confessions, not with 3 armed men looking for him and innocent people potentially in the crossfire. Jake. It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips made him look at her sharply. "Be careful, please." "I will," he promised, and then he was moving again, making his way toward the saloon with purpose. He found 2 of the strangers inside, nursing whiskeys at the bar and talking in low voices with the bartender. Jake pushed through the doors and walked directly toward them, his hand resting casually near his gun, and both men turned to look at him with the instant assessment of professionals. "I hear you are looking for me," Jake said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet saloon. "I am Jake Morrison." "What do you want?" The taller of the 2 men smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "That was easy. We expected to spend days tracking you down. I am not in the mood for games. State your business." "Our business is simple," the man said. "There is a price on your head, $500 paid by the family of one William Garrett, who you killed in Abilene last month. They want justice for his death, and we aim to collect the reward for bringing you in." Jake remembered Garrett, a loudmouth drunk who had accused him of cheating at cards and drawn on him in a crowded saloon. The shooting had been clean, with a dozen witnesses who could testify that Jake had tried to walk away before Garrett forced the issue. But apparently the family did not see it that way. "Garrett drew first," Jake said. "Every man in that saloon will tell you the same thing. It was self-defense." "Maybe so," the bounty hunter said, "but the family has money and connections, and they filed murder charges anyway. The law in Kansas wants you brought in to stand trial, and we aim to see that happens." Jake felt the old rage building in his chest, the unfairness of being hunted for defending himself. But underneath, the anger was something else, a calculation that had kept him alive this long. 3 against 1 were bad odds, especially in a crowded saloon where bullets could hit innocent people. He needed to get this confrontation somewhere safer, somewhere he could control the situation. "All right," he said slowly. "I will go with you, but not here in town where people could get hurt. We ride out to the canyon north of here and I will surrender peacefully." The bounty hunter looked suspicious. "Why would you do that?" "Because I do not want anyone else dying over this," Jake said honestly. "If I have to stand trial, I will do it. But I am not going to let you drag me out of here and risk some bystander catching a stray bullet. We do this my way, or we do it right here, right now, and I guarantee you will not all walk away." It was a bluff, but Jake sold it with the confidence of a man who had faced down death before. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, and finally the tall one nodded. "All right. We ride out in 1 hour. But if you try anything, if this is some kind of trick, we will come back here and burn this town to the ground." "Understood, understood," Jake said and turned to leave the saloon. His mind was racing as he walked back toward the boarding house. He could not actually surrender to these men, not when the murder charges were bogus, and the trial would be a farce designed to satisfy a wealthy family's need for revenge. But he also could not gun down 3 bounty hunters without confirming every bad thing people said about him. There had to be another way, some solution that would not end with more blood on his hands. He found Sarah waiting for him on the boarding house porch, her face pale but composed. "I saw you go into the saloon. What happened?" Jake told her quickly, laying out the situation and his agreement to ride out with the bounty hunters. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You are not actually going to surrender, are you?" she asked finally. "I cannot," Jake admitted. "The charges are false and the trial would be rigged, but I also cannot just kill 3 men for trying to do their job, twisted as the circumstances are." "Then what will you do?" Jake looked at her, this woman who had come to mean so much to him in such a short time, and felt the weight of all the things he wanted to say. "I am going to leave. I am going to ride out of here and keep riding until I am far enough away that no one will connect Dusty Creek with me. It is the only way to keep you and everyone else here safe." "No." Sarah's voice was firm, and she stood up from the porch railing, moving toward him. "That is not the only way. You are just choosing it because it is what you have always done. Run when things get hard, avoid connections that might tie you down. But there is another choice, Jake. You can stay and fight, not with guns but with the truth. You can go to the sheriff here in town and explain the situation, get him to wire Kansas and verify your story. If the shooting was self-defense with witnesses, then the charges cannot stand. You are assuming the law cares about the truth," Jake said bitterly. "In my experience, the law cares about who has the most money and influence. Maybe, but you will never know if you do not try. And even if it does not work, even if you end up having to stand trial, at least you will have faced it with honor instead of running away like a guilty man." Sarah reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and small in his rough palm. "I know you are scared. I am scared too. But I believe in you, Jake Morrison. I believe you are better than the life you have been living, and I believe you deserve a chance to prove it." Jake looked down at their joined hands, feeling something crack open in his chest, some wall he had built around his heart years ago crumbling in the face of this woman's faith in him. "What if I let you down? Then you let me down and we will deal with it. But I would rather take that risk than watch you throw away your chance at a real life because you are too afraid to fight for it." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Stay, Jake, please, let me help you." He wanted to argue, to list all the reasons why this was a bad idea, but the words would not come. Instead, he found himself nodding, committing to a course of action that terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. "All right, I will talk to the sheriff. But Sarah, if this goes wrong, if I end up dead or in prison, I need you to know something." "What?" "That morning when I watched you braid your hair for the first time, I knew. I knew that I wanted to see that every day of my life, that I wanted to wake up in a house where you were braiding your hair and making coffee and turning 4 walls into a home. I have never wanted anything like that before, never let myself imagine it, but you made me want it, made me believe it might be possible. And whatever happens next, I want you to know that you gave me that gift." Sarah's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "Then fight for it, Jake. Fight for that future you want. Do not let them take it away before you even have a chance to live it." Jake pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a way that probably scandalized any neighbors who might be watching, but he did not care. He held her for a long moment, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest, and promised himself that he would do whatever it took to deserve this woman's faith in him. Then he released her and went to find the sheriff. Dusty Creek's lawman was a man named Tom Brennan, a former Texas Ranger who had settled into the quieter job of town sheriff after years of chasing outlaws, and keeping the peace in rougher territories. He listened to Jake's story without interrupting, his weathered face giving nothing away, and when Jake finished, Brennan leaned back in his chair and studied him thoughtfully. "I heard about the shooting in Abilene," the sheriff said finally. "Word travels fast in certain circles. From what I understood, it was a clean draw, self-defense all the way." "That is the truth," Jake said, "but apparently the family has enough influence to get murder charges filed anyway." Brennan nodded slowly. "The Garretts are rich and they are connected." "That does not mean the charges will stick, but it does mean you would be in for a fight if you go back to Kansas." "I know, but I am tired of running, Sheriff. I am tired of living like every day might be my last, never putting down roots, never letting myself care about anything. I want a different life, and I am willing to stand trial if that is what it takes to prove I am not a murderer." The sheriff regarded him for a long moment, and Jake forced himself to meet the older man's gaze steadily, letting him see the sincerity behind the words. Finally, Brennan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "Those bounty hunters are going to expect you to ride out with them," he said. "When you do not show up, they are going to come looking and things could get ugly. I know." "So here is what we are going to do," Brennan said, turning back to face him. "I am going to wire the marshal in Abilene and get a statement about the shooting, confirmation that there were witnesses who will testify on your behalf. While I am waiting for a response, I am going to place you in protective custody, which is a fancy way of saying you are going to stay in one of my cells where those bounty hunters cannot touch you. Once I have the facts straight, I will deal with them personally." Jake felt a surge of relief so strong it almost buckled his knees. "Thank you, Sheriff. I do not know what to say." "Do not thank me yet," Brennan said dryly. "You are still going to have to face this eventually, and I cannot promise how it will turn out. But I believe in doing things the right way, and hauling you off based on questionable charges is not the right way. Now come on, let's get you secured before those bounty hunters realize you are not coming." The cell was small but clean, with a narrow cot and a barred window that looked out onto the alley behind the sheriff's office. Jake sat on the cot and tried not to think about the last time he had been in a jail cell. 19 years old and waiting to be released after a bar fight that had not been his fault. He had sworn then that he would never let himself be caged again, and yet here he was, voluntarily walking into confinement because a woman with green-brown eyes had convinced him to stop running. The hours passed slowly. Jake heard the bounty hunters come looking for him, their voices loud and angry in the front office, and Sheriff Brennan's calm responses as he explained that Jake Morrison was in protective custody pending an investigation into the charges. There was a lot of shouting and threats, but eventually the bounty hunters left, presumably to wait and see what happened next. Sarah came to see him as the sun was setting, the sheriff allowing her into the cell block with a knowing look that suggested he had seen the way Jake looked at her. She carried a basket with food and coffee, and Jake felt his throat tighten at the simple kindness of the gesture. "How are you holding up?" she asked, passing the basket through the bars. "I have been better," Jake admitted, "but I have been worse too. At least here I know the sheriff is on my side." Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down just outside the cell, close enough that Jake could have reached through the bars and touched her if he wanted to. They talked quietly while he ate, about nothing and everything, and Jake marveled at how Sarah could make even a jail cell feel less oppressive just by being there. "I have been thinking," Sarah said after a while, her voice soft. "About what you said earlier, about wanting to see me braid my hair every morning. Jake, I need you to know that I feel the same way. I want to wake up knowing you will be there, that we will have coffee together and talk about our plans for the day. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like." Jake set down the tin cup he had been holding, his hands suddenly unsteady. "Sarah, you barely know me. A few weeks does not seem like enough time to make that kind of decision." "How much time does it take?" she countered. "I have seen your character, Jake. I have watched the way you treat people, the effort you make to be better than your past. I have listened to you talk about your regrets and your hopes, and I know in my heart that you are a good man who has made some bad choices. That is enough for me. What if the trial goes badly? What if I end up in prison or worse? Then I will wait for you, or I will mourn you, but I will not regret choosing to love you. Sarah's voice was fierce, and Jake could see the truth of her words in her eyes. I spent too long after my fiancé died being afraid to feel anything, afraid that loving someone meant setting myself up for more loss. But you taught me that living in fear is not really living at all. So I am choosing to love you, Jake Morrison, consequences and all. Jake stood up and moved to the bars, reaching through to cup Sarah's face in his hand, his thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. I love you too, he said, the words feeling both strange and perfectly right. I do not know when it happened or how, but somewhere between watching you braid your hair and listening to you talk about regret and purpose, I fell completely in love with you. And I swear to you, Sarah, I will do everything in my power to build the life you deserve. She turned her face into his palm, kissing it gently, and they stayed like that for a long moment, connected through the bars but feeling closer than Jake had ever felt to another human being. Sheriff Brennan's investigation took 3 days, during which Jake remained in the cell and tried not to go crazy from the inactivity. Sarah visited every day, bringing food and books and her quiet company, and Jake found himself looking forward to those visits with an intensity that would have embarrassed him if he had been a different kind of man. They talked about everything during those hours, planning a future that might never happen but feeling necessary to imagine anyway. Sarah told him about the house she dreamed of having someday, nothing fancy but with a big kitchen and a porch where they could sit in the evenings. Jake described the horses he would raise, a small breeding operation that would give him honest work and a reason to stay in one place. They argued good-naturedly about whether to have 3 children or 4, and Jake teased her about her terrible singing voice until she threw a piece of bread at him through the bars. On the 3rd day, Sheriff Brennan came to the cell with a telegram in his hand and an expression Jake could not quite read. I heard back from the marshal in Abilene. Jake stood up, his heart pounding, and the charges are being dropped. The marshal interviewed all the witnesses again, and every single one confirmed that Garrett drew first and you had no choice but to defend yourself. The family is not happy about it, but there is not enough evidence to support a murder charge. You are free to go, Morrison. The relief was so overwhelming that Jake had to sit down on the cot, his legs suddenly weak. The bounty hunters left town yesterday when they realized I was not going to hand you over without a fight. They will be headed back to Kansas with the news that the charges are dropped, so you should not have any more trouble from that quarter. Brennan unlocked the cell door and swung it open. You are a lucky man, Morrison. Not many people get a second chance like this. I know, Jake said, standing up and extending his hand. Thank you, Sheriff, for believing me and for doing the right thing. Brennan shook his hand firmly. Just make sure you live up to that second chance. Miss Bennett seems like a fine woman and she has put her faith in you. Do not make her regret it. I will not, Jake promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. He walked out of the sheriff's office into the bright afternoon sun, blinking at the sudden light and the vast open sky above him. Sarah was waiting across the street, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a joy so pure that Jake felt his chest tighten. She ran toward him, propriety forgotten, and Jake caught her in his arms, lifting her off the ground and spinning her around while she laughed. It is over, he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. The charges are dropped. I am free, Sarah, really free for the first time in years. I knew it would work out, she said, tears streaming down her face even as she smiled. I knew you just had to fight for it. Jake kissed her then, right there in the middle of the street with half the town watching, and he did not care who saw or what they thought. This woman had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with the dropped charges, had given him a reason to be better and the courage to stop running. He would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted that choice. They were married a month later, in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Sarah wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar, and Jake wore his best clothes, cleaned and pressed with Sarah's help. Sheriff Brennan stood as his witness, and Sarah's aunt, who had returned from San Antonio just in time for the wedding, stood as hers. The ceremony was short, the words traditional, but when Jake slipped the simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, he felt the weight of the promise he was making. To love and cherish in sickness and health, for better or worse, as long as they both lived. He had never thought he would say those words, never believed he was capable of the kind of commitment they represented. But looking into Sarah's eyes as she made her own promises, Jake knew with absolute certainty that he would keep his vows until his last breath. They moved into a small house on the outskirts of town. 2 rooms that Sarah transformed into a home with curtains and rugs and the 1,000 small touches that made a space livable. Jake took a job as a deputy sheriff, Brennan having offered him the position after seeing how he had handled the situation with the bounty hunters. It was honest work that used his skills in a constructive way, and Jake found satisfaction in keeping the peace and helping people instead of just trying to survive. Sarah continued to work at her aunt's boarding house during the day, and Jake would stop by at lunch when he could, stealing a few minutes with his wife in the middle of their busy schedules. But the moments he treasured most were the mornings, when he would wake before dawn and pad quietly into the small kitchen to make coffee, timing it perfectly so that Sarah would emerge from the bedroom just as it finished brewing. And every morning, without fail, Jake would watch as Sarah stood by the window and braided her hair using the mirror he had given her, the early light turning her into something ethereal. She never hurried the ritual, her fingers moving with practiced ease, and Jake never grew tired of watching it. This was what home looked like, he realized. This quiet routine, this simple act repeated day after day, was what he had been searching for all those years without knowing it. One morning, about 6 months after their wedding, Sarah finished her braid and turned to find Jake watching her with an expression that made her smile. "What are you thinking about?" "About the day I first saw you do that," Jake said. "About how I knew, even then, that I wanted to see it every morning for the rest of my life." Sarah crossed the kitchen and slid into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "And now you get to. Was it worth all the trouble?" "Every bit of it," Jake said, kissing her gently. "You are worth everything, Sarah Morrison." She rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a while, drinking their coffee and watching the sun come up over the Texas plains. Jake felt a contentment he had not known existed, a deep, bone-level satisfaction that came from being exactly where he was supposed to be with exactly the person he was meant to love. Their first child, a boy they named Thomas after Sheriff Brennan, was born the following spring during a thunderstorm that shook the little house and made Sarah laugh even through her labor pains. Jake paced the bedroom like a caged animal while the midwife worked, terrified that something would go wrong, that he would lose the 2 people who had become his entire world. But when he finally heard his son's first cry, strong and indignant, Jake felt tears stream down his face with relief and joy. Sarah was exhausted but radiant, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and when the midwife placed the baby in her arms, Jake watched his wife transform into a mother before his eyes. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, marveling at the tiny person they had created, and when Sarah looked up at him with tired eyes and a glowing smile, Jake felt his heart expand in a way he had not thought possible. "We made him," she whispered in wonder. "This perfect little person is ours." "He is beautiful," Jake said, running a gentle finger over his son's impossibly soft cheek. "He has your eyes. And your stubbornness, if that crying is any indication," Sarah teased, and Jake laughed, the sound strange and wonderful after the tension of the last few hours. They named their second child, a daughter, Catherine, and she arrived 2 years later with far less drama, entering the world on a quiet summer morning when the air was already warm and the cicadas were singing. She was smaller than Thomas had been, with dark hair and a serious expression that made Jake think she was already contemplating the mysteries of the universe. Sarah recovered quickly from this birth, and within days she was back to her normal routines, though Jake noticed she tired more easily and took more breaks. "We are getting older," Sarah said when he expressed concern. "That is what happens, our bodies change and we have to adjust." Jake pulled her close, his hand resting on her hip. "You are even more beautiful now than the day I first saw you braiding your hair." "That is because you love me," Sarah said practically. "Love makes people look different." "Maybe," Jake allowed. "Or maybe I just see what was always there, and it keeps revealing new layers the longer I look." Their third child came 3 years after Catherine, another boy they named William, who was loud and energetic from the moment he entered the world. By this time, Jake had been promoted to sheriff after Brennan retired, and the family had moved into a larger house that could accommodate the growing brood. Sarah had stopped working at the boarding house after Thomas was born, her hands full with raising the children and managing their home, but she seemed happy in her role as wife and mother. Jake would watch her sometimes when she did not know he was looking, studying the way she moved through their house with easy competence, managing 3 children and a household with the same calm efficiency she had brought to the boarding house. She braided her hair every morning, the ritual unchanged even as everything else in their lives transformed, and Jake never stopped treasuring those quiet moments before the chaos of the day began. The years passed in the way years do when life is full and mostly happy, bringing challenges and joys in equal measure. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved books and had his mother's thoughtful nature. Catherine was stubborn and fierce, with a sense of justice that reminded Jake of himself at that age. William was pure energy, constantly getting into trouble and keeping his parents on their toes. Jake's reputation as a fair but firm sheriff spread throughout the region, and Dusty Creek grew from a small frontier town into a proper community with a school, a church, and enough businesses to support the ranchers and farmers in the surrounding area. Sarah became known for her kindness and her willingness to help anyone in need, often showing up at sick neighbors' houses with food and medicine, or taking in the children of families going through hard times. They built a life together that was ordinary in all the best ways, full of the small dramas and daily routines that made up a good marriage. They argued sometimes, usually about money or how to discipline the children, but they always made up before bed, refusing to let anger fester. They laughed together, often at the absurdities of parenting or the quirks of their neighbors. They supported each other through difficulties, like when Sarah's aunt passed away or when Jake had to shoot a man in the line of duty and struggled with the old demons that came rushing back. Through it all, the morning ritual remained constant. Every day, Jake would wake early and make coffee, and Sarah would emerge from their bedroom and braid her hair by the window while he watched. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, but always there was that moment of connection, that reaffirmation of the choice they had made to build this life together. On their 10th anniversary, Jake surprised Sarah with a trip to San Antonio, arranging for Sarah's friend to watch the children for a week. They stayed in a hotel that felt impossibly fancy after years of their simple lifestyle, and Jake took her to restaurants and shops and even to the theater. But his favorite part of the trip was the mornings, when they would wake in the unfamiliar room and Sarah would braid her hair just like she did at home, the ritual grounding them no matter where they were. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked one morning as they sat together after breakfast, watching the city wake up below their window. "Choosing me, I mean, tying yourself to a man with a dangerous past." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Not for a single moment do you regret staying." "Giving up your freedom to settle down with me. Freedom is not what I thought it was," Jake said slowly, trying to put years of realization into words. I thought it meant having no ties, no responsibilities, being able to go wherever I wanted whenever I wanted, but that was not freedom. That was just loneliness dressed up as adventure. Real freedom is choosing who you want to be and who you want to be with, and then having the courage to build that life. You gave me that, Sarah. You gave me freedom by giving me something worth staying for. She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and Jake felt the same flutter in his chest that he had felt on their wedding day. 10 years of marriage, 3 children, countless mornings watching her braid her hair, and he was more in love with her now than he had been at the beginning. That was the real miracle, he thought. Not that they had found each other, but that they had kept choosing each other every day since. Their 4th child, another daughter they named Mary, arrived when Sarah was 36 and Jake was 40. The pregnancy had been harder than the others, and the doctor warned them that another baby would be risky. They were content with their 4 children, each one loved and wanted, and Jake had a vasectomy to ensure that Sarah would not have to face another difficult pregnancy. Mary was sweet-natured and cheerful, bringing a lightness to the family that balanced out Thomas's seriousness and William's intensity. Catherine adored her baby sister, taking on the role of protector and second mother with enthusiasm. The house was loud and chaotic and full of love, and Jake would sometimes stand in the doorway watching his family and marvel at how different his life was from what he had imagined all those years ago. Thomas went off to college when he was 18, the first Morrison to pursue higher education, and Jake felt a complicated mix of pride and sorrow watching his oldest child leave home. Catherine fell in love with a young rancher when she was 19, and Jake had to admit, grudgingly, that the boy seemed decent and hardworking. William announced that he wanted to be a lawman like his father, and Jake spent long hours teaching him not just how to shoot and track, but about the weight of responsibility that came with wearing a badge. Sarah's hair started to gray when she was in her early 40s, silver threads appearing among the brown, and Jake thought it made her even more beautiful. She still braided it every morning, though her fingers moved a bit more slowly now, and Jake still watched with the same devotion he had felt from the beginning. Some mornings their children would stumble into the kitchen to find their parents sitting quietly together, coffee in hand, and they would roll their eyes at the obvious affection between them. "You two are ridiculous," Catherine said once, though she was smiling. "Still acting like newlyweds after all these years." "That is because your mother is still the most fascinating woman I have ever met," Jake said, pulling Sarah close and kissing her temple. "And I plan to keep being ridiculous about it until the day I die." The children groaned, but Sarah laughed and swatted Jake playfully, and he saw the way Catherine watched them with a kind of longing, as if hoping to find that kind of love for herself someday. When Jake was 52, a group of young men robbed the bank in Dusty Creek, and Jake had to lead a posse to track them down. They caught up with the robbers 2 days later, and in the ensuing confrontation, Jake took a bullet to the shoulder that shattered bone and left his right arm significantly weakened. He survived, but the injury ended his career as sheriff, and at 52, Jake Morrison found himself having to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. Sarah nursed him through the recovery with patient determination, helping him with exercises to regain strength and range of motion, never letting him sink into the depression that threatened in the early days when the pain was constant, and he felt useless. Eventually, Jake regained enough function to do most tasks, though his fast-draw days were permanently behind him. He took a job as a clerk in the land office, using his knowledge of the region to help newcomers find property and file claims. It was quieter work than being sheriff, but Jake found he did not mind. He was tired of violence, tired of the constant vigilance that law enforcement required. He wanted to spend his remaining years in peace, watching his children build their own lives and enjoying the woman who had transformed everything for him. Catherine married her rancher when she was 21, and Jake walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his face, torn between joy at her happiness and grief at losing his little girl. Thomas became a lawyer and set up practice in San Antonio, visiting home several times a year and always staying in his old room. William became a deputy sheriff in a neighboring county, and Jake tried not to worry too much about the dangers his son faced on the job. Mary, their youngest, turned into a talented artist who sold paintings to people all over Texas, her gift for capturing the beauty of the landscape in oil and watercolor bringing joy to both her family and her customers. Jake and Sarah became grandparents when Catherine's first child, a boy, was born, and then again and again as their children started families of their own. The grandchildren would come to visit, and the house that had grown quiet after the children moved out would be full of noise and laughter once more. Sarah would bake cookies and tell stories, and Jake would teach the older grandchildren to ride and rope, passing on skills he had learned a lifetime ago. Through it all, through the passage of years and the changes that time inevitably brought, the morning ritual remained. Jake would wake early, his body protesting more now with the aches and pains of age, and make coffee in their kitchen. Sarah would emerge, her hair now more silver than brown, and stand by the window to braid it. Her fingers were slower than they had been, arthritis making the movements more deliberate, but she never skipped the ritual. And Jake never stopped watching, never grew tired of seeing this woman he loved so much perform this simple act of self-care and routine. "Do you remember the first time you watched me do this?" Sarah asked one morning when Jake was 68 and she was 62. They had been married for 34 years, and Jake could hardly remember what life had been like before her. "I remember every detail," Jake said. "The way the light came through the window, the concentration on your face, the way your hands moved so surely. I remember thinking that I wanted to see that every day of my life. And have you?" Sarah asked, turning to look at him with eyes that were still as keen and intelligent as they had been when he first met her. "Every single day," Jake confirmed. "And I still feel the same way I did then. I still want to see it tomorrow and the day after and for however many days we have left." Sarah finished her braid and came to sit beside him, and Jake wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her close. They sat together in the quiet kitchen, drinking their coffee and watching the sun come up, and Jake thought about the long road that had brought him to this moment. The violence and fear of his youth seemed like someone else's life now, distant and unreal compared to the solid reality of the life he had built with Sarah. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as they had been the day he first spoke them through the bars of a jail cell. "You saved me, Sarah Morrison. You took a lost, angry man and showed him what it meant to have a home and a purpose. Everything good in my life started the day I met you." "I did not save you," Sarah said gently. "You saved yourself by choosing to stay, by choosing to fight for something better. I just gave you a reason to do it. You gave me everything," Jake insisted, "and I will spend whatever time I have left trying to deserve it." Sarah kissed him softly, her lips familiar and beloved, and Jake closed his eyes, memorizing the feel of this moment, this woman, this life that had exceeded his wildest dreams. Jake Morrison lived to be 74 years old, long enough to see all 4 of his children happily settled with families of their own, long enough to meet 15 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter night, Sarah curled beside him the way she had been for nearly 40 years. The doctor said his heart simply wore out, a natural end to a life well lived. Sarah lived for another 7 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still braiding her hair every morning even when her hands shook so badly it took 3 times as long as it once had. She died at 81, holding Catherine's hand and smiling, her last words a whispered, "Tell your father I am coming." They were buried side by side in the Dusty Creek Cemetery, under a pair of oak trees that provided shade in summer and shelter in winter. The headstone was simple, listing their names and dates, but someone, probably Catherine, had added an inscription at the bottom. He watched her braid her hair every morning and said he wanted to see it every day of his life. She gave him that and so much more. Years after both of them were gone, their great-grandchildren would visit the graves and listen to the stories about Jake and Sarah Morrison, about the cowboy who had been running from his past, and the woman who had convinced him to stand and fight. They would hear about the mourning ritual that lasted 40 years, about the deep, abiding love that grew from a chance meeting in a boarding house. They would learn that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop running and let yourself be loved, and that the most extraordinary lives are often built from ordinary moments repeated with devotion. And in the mornings, when the sun came up over the Texas plains and illuminated the graves under the oak trees, it was easy to imagine Jake Morrison sitting with his coffee, watching his beloved Sarah braid her hair one more time, grateful for every single day he had been given with her, and knowing that he had kept his promise to see it every day of his life. The small boarding house where they met still stood in Dusty Creek, converted now into a museum that celebrated the town's history. In one room, preserved behind glass, was a hand mirror with a carved wooden frame, a simple object that represented the beginning of a love story that had lasted a lifetime. Visitors would look at it and read the placard explaining its significance, and some would smile, understanding the romance of such a small gesture. But the real legacy of Jake and Sarah Morrison was not in museums or headstones, or even in the stories their descendants told. It was in the example they set, the proof that people could change, that love could heal old wounds, that a life built on honesty and commitment, and showing up for each other every single day was worth more than all the adventures and freedom in the world. Thomas Morrison became a judge, known for his fairness and his belief that people deserved second chances. Catherine raised 6 children on her ranch, teaching them about hard work and the importance of fighting for what you believed in. William served as sheriff for 30 years, protecting his community with the same dedication his father had shown. Mary's paintings hung in galleries across Texas, capturing the wild beauty of the land her parents had loved. All of them braided their daughters' hair when the girls were young, teaching them the same ritual their mother had performed every morning, passing down the tradition without always explaining why it mattered. And when those daughters grew up and had children of their own, they would sometimes pause while braiding their own hair, feeling connected to something larger than themselves, part of a lineage of strong women who had loved and been loved in return. The town of Dusty Creek grew and changed over the decades, but the story of Jake and Sarah Morrison remained, told and retold until it took on the quality of legend. Young couples would stand where the boarding house had been and promise each other forever, hoping to find even a fraction of what the Morrisons had built together. Old-timers would shake their heads and say they did not make love like that anymore, though the truth was that love like that had always been rare and precious. But it was possible. That was the point of the story, the reason it endured. It was possible for a man to change his life completely if he found the right reason and the right person. It was possible for a woman to see past a dangerous reputation to the good man underneath. It was possible to build something lasting out of ordinary moments and daily choices, to create a love that sustained through decades of challenges and triumphs. And it all started with a cowboy watching a woman braid her hair in the morning light, and knowing with sudden, absolute certainty that he wanted to see that every day of his life. He fought for that chance, stayed when every instinct told him to run, and built a life so full and rich that when he finally laid down to rest for the last time, he did so with no regrets and a heart full of gratitude. That was the legacy of Jake and Sarah Morrison. Not perfection, but persistence. Not a fairy tale, but a real love built by 2 imperfect people who chose each other every single day and never stopped choosing, even when it was hard, even when they were scared, even when the world told them it would not work. They proved it could work. They proved that love, real love, the kind that lasted and deepened and grew stronger with time, was worth fighting for. They proved that the smallest gestures, a braided hair, a cup of coffee, a moment of watching someone you love perform a daily ritual, could contain entire universes of meaning. And somewhere, in whatever comes after this life, Jake Morrison was still watching Sarah braid her hair every morning, still marveling at his good fortune, still grateful beyond words that he had stopped running long enough to let himself be saved by the love of a good woman. And Sarah was still smiling at him over her shoulder, still making coffee in their kitchen, still choosing him just as much as he chose her, every morning. Every single morning, for all the days of their lives and whatever came after.